There was a God in the ancient world who did not want grain. He did not want gold. He did not want the blood of animals, or the smoke of incense, or the songs of 1,000 priests at dawn. Molech wanted one thing, and he wanted it from the people who could least afford to give it. He wanted children, not as a metaphor, not as a ritual symbol. He wanted them carried into a valley just outside the city walls, placed on a burning altar, and consumed by fire, while drums played loud enough to cover the sounds coming from inside the flames. This was not a primitive practice from the edges of the ancient world. This happened in the valley directly below Jerusalem, the city God chose as his own, the city where his temple stood. And it was not done by pagans or foreigners or enemies of Israel. It was done by Israelite kings from the line of David, by fathers who had held their sons in their arms and then walked them into the fire because a theology had told them, slowly and patiently across generations, that this was the price. His name in Hebrew comes from the same root as the word for king, Melech, the great king, the royal one. Every version of his name across every language that preserved him makes the same claim. He does not ask. He does not negotiate. He rules and he collects. The Bible mentions him by name. God himself prohibits him by name in the law. And then the Bible describes, in precise historical detail, exactly how a people who had seen God part the sea and rain bread from heaven ended up burning their children in a valley anyway, and why the structure Molech built, not the altar, not the fire, but the logic underneath both of them, never actually collapsed when the altars did. That is what we are going to examine carefully, because the answer did not stay in the ancient world. The name Molech comes from the same Semitic root as the Hebrew word Melech, which means king. In Ammonite inscriptions, the deity appears as Milcom, the great king, the royal one. In Phoenician texts, he appears as Malach or Moloch. The names shift, but the root never does. Every version of this god's name is a claim to sovereignty. He does not ask, he does not negotiate, he rules and he collects. His cult originated in Ammon, the nation that occupied the eastern side of the Jordan River, directly across from the territories Israel would inherit. The Ammonites had worshipped him for centuries before Israel arrived. When Israel settled the land, Molech was already there. His altars were already standing. His priests were already established. His theology was already complete, but his reach did not stop at Ammon. The archaeological and textual record traces Molech worshiped west through Phoenicia, north through Syria, and deep into the coastal cities of Canaan. By the time of the biblical narratives, he was not a local Ammonite practice. He was a regional institution, and then he moved further. In the 7th century BC, Phoenician colonists carried their religion with them across the Mediterranean and founded the city of Carthage on the coast of North Africa. When archaeologists excavated Carthage in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found something that changed the scholarly conversation about Molech permanently. They found a Tophet, not a metaphor, not a symbol, an actual physical installation, a sacred precinct filled with burial urns containing the cremated remains of children, thousands of them. The urns were accompanied by votive stelae, stone markers carved with dedications to the gods. The inscription formula appeared repeatedly. To Baal-Hamon and Tanit, this was given. The children were the gift. The children were the payment. The children were the price. For a century, scholars argued about whether the Carthaginian Tophet represented child sacrifice or simply the burial of children who had died naturally. That argument is now largely settled. The forensic evidence, the burn patterns, the age distribution of the remains concentrated heavily in infants and young children under 3. The stratigraphic relationship between the urns and the votive stones points in one direction. These children were not buried here after dying naturally. They were killed here intentionally as offerings. Carthage was a Phoenician colony. Phoenicia connected directly to the Canaanite religious world, and the Canaanite religious world was the world Israel had moved into. This is not distant mythology. The Tophets of Carthage are not isolated archaeological curiosities. They are the same system that the Hebrew prophets describe operating in the valley, just outside Jerusalem. The same fires, the same logic, the same God receiving the same payment on two continents simultaneously. But how? That is always the question that gets asked too late. Israel did not wake up one morning and decide to burn their children. No nation does. No people arrive at the worst thing they will ever do in a single step. They arrive by following a logic they began following long before they understood where it led. The book of Judges records a pattern that repeats 7 times in its pages. Israel enters the land. Israel serves God. Israel begins to worship the gods of the surrounding nations. Israel suffers. Israel cries out. God rescues them, and then it starts again. Each cycle, each rotation of the wheel, pulled slightly deeper. The gods of Canaan were not primarily spiritual. That is the detail that is almost always missed in the retelling. They were economic. Baal offered rain and harvest. Asherah offered fertility, safe pregnancies, children born alive. The entire system was built on transaction. Perform the ritual correctly, deliver the offering on schedule, and the god delivers the result. Religion as an insurance policy. Faith as a commercial contract. Israel did not abandon the God of Sinai to embrace this system. That is not what the text describes. The book of Judges says they served the Lord and the Baals simultaneously. They kept the feasts. They maintained the priesthood. They offered the prescribed sacrifices in the prescribed ways. And then, just in case the rains did not come, they also maintained the local altars on the hilltops. They kept both systems running in parallel. The logic seemed reasonable to people who had never farmed before and who were terrified of drought. The logic was spiritually catastrophic because theology has consequences. The beliefs that seem like modest accommodations at the beginning do not stay modest. They follow their own internal logic. They extend toward their conclusions. And the conclusion of transactional religion, the conclusion of a theology that says the gods can be purchased, that the right offering guarantees the right result, that there is always a higher payment available for a higher outcome, that conclusion has always been the same. If a small offering produces a small result, what does the greatest offering produce? If grain produces rain, if oil produces favor, if the blood of animals produces protection from plague, what does the blood of a child produce? What does the most precious thing you own purchase from a god whose entire system runs on the principle that every transaction has a price? This is the logic that Molech offered, not as an aberration, as a completion, as the final, most honest expression of what Baal's theology had always implied, but never said aloud. No nation arrives at Molech without first passing through Baal. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. The valley of burning children outside Jerusalem was not a random catastrophe. It was a destination. It was the place that the theology of transaction had always been walking toward. One hilltop altar, one compromised feast, one generation of children raised inside parallel religion at a time. There is something in this pattern that does not stay safely ancient. Every generation finds its version of the same path. Every generation encounters the same seduction, the system that promises results, that offers certainty in exchange for escalating payment, that never announces its destination until you are already close enough to hear the drums. The drums. The Hebrew word toph means drum. The place of Molech's worship just outside Jerusalem was called the Topheth, the place of the drums. Those drums were not ceremonial. They were not musical. They were not there to honor the god with rhythmic praise. They were there to drown out the sounds, not the crackling of wood, not the roar of the flames, the sounds that came from within the fire, the sounds that parents could not be allowed to hear clearly, because if they heard them with full clarity, some of them might stop. The drums were a mercy of a kind so devastating that the word mercy barely survives the context. The valley where this occurred lay just outside the southern wall of Jerusalem, a narrow ravine that wound between the city walls and the hills to the south and west. It was called Gehenna in Hebrew, the valley of the son of Hinnom. Modern maps still mark it. You can walk there today. It is a green, quiet space now, with benches and footpaths. Tourists walk through it without knowing what it once was. At its lowest point, inside that valley, the Topeth was built. Not a primitive structure, an installation, a dedicated precinct with an altar designed specifically for this purpose, maintained by a dedicated priesthood, operational for generations. The prophet Jeremiah describes it in chapter 7 with a specificity that suggests he had been there. He names it, he describes what happens there, and then he records what God says about it. Not anger, or at least not anger first, something that reads in the Hebrew as closer to grief, to stunned incomprehension. God says, "They built the high places of Topheth to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, which I did not command, and which did not come into my mind." Which did not come into my mind. Read that carefully. The God who created the universe, who fashioned every human face, who according to the psalmist knit each person together in their mother's womb. This God looks at what is happening in the valley below his city and says, "This is not something I thought of. This did not originate in me. This idea did not come from me. I did not conceive of it." The most disturbing thing about that statement is not what it says about Molech. It is what it says about the distance between what God intended for human beings and what human beings had done with themselves. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something directly, not hypothetically. Actually, if everyone around you was doing it, if your neighbors, your king, the government, the established priesthood all maintained this system as normal, would you have been the one to say no? Be honest with yourself, because what comes next is the story of the people who did not say no early enough, and what it cost. Tell me in the comments, because this question matters more than it might seem right now. The first crack appeared before the monarchy had even reached its worst. It appeared at the height of its glory. Solomon, son of David, the king who built the temple, the king who asked for wisdom and received it, the king under whose reign Israel reached the fullest extent of its territory and the deepest expression of its covenant relationship with God. Solomon built a high place for Molech. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 7. A high place for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites, on the hill east of Jerusalem. This is not a story about Israel's worst king. This is a story about Israel's wisest man, in the fullness of his power, dedicating a place of worship to the God who would one day receive their children. He built it for his foreign wives, the text says. A gesture of accommodation, a diplomatic compromise. He did not worship there himself. The text does not say that, but the structure stood, and structures outlast the intentions of those who build them. Because after Solomon came Ahaz. Ahaz was a king of Judah, a descendant of David, a man sitting on the same throne that had once housed the covenant line of God's chosen people. 2 Chronicles 28, verse 3. He burned his sons in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Not a son, sons, plural. He was a king. He had every resource available to him. He had a standing army, an established priesthood, a functioning temple, and he took his own children into the valley and burned them. This was not poverty. This was not desperation in the crude survival sense. This was theology. This was a man who had been trained to think of religion as transaction, and who had followed that logic to its furthest expression available to him. He gave the most valuable thing he had. He expected the most valuable result in return. After Ahaz came Manasseh, who ruled Judah for 55 years, the longest reign of any king in the Davidic line. 2 Kings 21, verse 6. He burned his son as an offering. He used fortune-telling and omens. He dealt with mediums and necromancers. Under Manasseh, the Topheth did not operate on the margins of Israelite religion. It operated alongside it. The temple was still standing. The priests were still functioning. The feasts were still observed. And in the valley just below the city walls, the drums were playing. For 55 years. The silence of heaven during those 55 years is one of the most disturbing things in the entire biblical narrative. There was no plague, no earthquake, no fire from the sky. The building stood. The priesthood continued. From the outside, the religion of Israel appeared intact. but God had spoken through Jeremiah what was coming. In chapter 32, verse 35, he says of the child sacrifices in the valley, "I did not command them, nor did it come into my mind that they should do this abomination, to cause Judah to sin." The grief in that sentence has no bottom. The God who had chosen this city, who had placed his name there, who had watched every morning in that valley from the foundation of its creation, saying in the beginning, "I did not make you for this." Then, in 621 BC, a 26-year-old king, who had been on the throne since he was 8 years old, heard the words of the law read aloud for what may have been the first time. The high priest Hilkiah had been overseeing repairs to the temple, repairs to a building that had been so neglected under decades of idolatrous kings that the book of the law had been lost somewhere inside it, buried under rubble and disuse. When the scroll was found and read to the young king, Josiah's response was immediate and physical. He tore his robes, he wept, he sent immediately to inquire of God, because he understood, perhaps with terrible clarity, the distance between what God had required and what Israel had become. To understand how extraordinary this response was, you have to understand who this young man was descended from. His grandfather was Manasseh, who burned his own son in the valley. His father was Ammon, so corrupt and so despised that his own servants assassinated him after 2 years on the throne. Josiah grew up inside a lineage of unbroken spiritual catastrophe, and yet when he encountered the actual words of God, something broke open in him that all of that history had not been able to suppress. 2 Kings 23 records what followed. Josiah went to the Topheth. He defiled it. He desecrated the installation so thoroughly that it could not be used again. He broke the altars, scattered the ash, made the site ritually impure according to the law. He dismantled the high place Solomon had built for Molech on the hill east of Jerusalem, the one that had stood for 3.5 centuries. He tore it down stone from stone. 2 Kings records its verdict plainly. Before him, there was no king like him who turned to God with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. Then in 609 BC, at the age of 39, Josiah rode out to intercept Pharaoh Necho at the Valley of Megiddo. He was killed by an archer. His body was brought back to Jerusalem in a chariot. The nation mourned. Within 23 years of his death, every altar had been rebuilt. Every high place had been restored. The Topheth, which Josiah had defiled, was operational again. The greatest reform in Israel's history lasted less than a single generation. This is the detail that never receives enough attention. Not the reform itself, but its reversal. Not the extraordinary king who dismantled the system, but the speed with which the system rebuilt itself the moment he was gone. The altars did not need a generation to return. They needed months, because the theology that fed them had never actually left. The transaction had not been renounced, only interrupted, and transactions on hold resume the moment the interruption ends. After the Babylonian exile, the valley of Hinnom was not rebuilt. It was not restored to agricultural use or domestic habitation. It became instead what its history had made it, a wound in the earth that the city of Jerusalem kept at a careful distance. Jerusalem's refuse was burned there. The fires smoldered constantly. What the flames did not consume, decay processed in the open air. Smoke rose from it in thin columns, visible from the city walls. It became the city's open wound that would not close, the place everyone knew the name of and no one wanted to approach. Jeremiah had already declared its new name. God says through him, "It will no longer be called Topheth or the Valley of the Son of Hinnom, but the Valley of Slaughter." In Greek, Gehenna became a single compound word, Gehenna. In the New Testament, the word Gehenna appears 12 times. 11 of those 12 appearances come from the lips of Jesus of Nazareth. He uses it in the Sermon on the Mount. He uses it when warning his disciples about the fear of God. He uses it in the 9th chapter of Mark, when he describes it as the place where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. language drawn directly from the closing verses of Isaiah, 11 of 12 times. His primary term for the place of final, permanent separation from God was the name of a valley his listeners walked past on the road out of Jerusalem. A valley every person in his audience could identify by sight, by smell, by history. Some of them had smelled the smoke in their childhoods. Some of them knew grandparents who had seen the Topheth operating before Josiah's reform. All of them knew what the valley was and what it had been. Jesus did not choose this word accidentally. He was not reaching for a dramatic metaphor from philosophy or mythology. He pointed at a real geography. He said, "That place, the place your city built to manage what it could not bring itself to stop, the place your ancestors filled with the worst thing they ever did, the place that still burns. That is the image I want you to hold when you think about permanent, irreversible separation from everything that is good. The valley where Israel committed its worst act against God became the word that God's Son used to describe the ultimate consequence of choosing against God. That is not coincidence. That is the Bible making the connection explicit. The logic of Molech and the logic of final judgment are not unrelated. Both are the destination of a theology that puts a price on everything and a relationship on nothing. Both are what happens when the transaction is followed to its furthest conclusion. After the exile, the altars of Molech were never rebuilt. His name fades from the historical record. No Topheth appears in post-exilic Jewish sources. The practice, as far as the surviving record shows, ended. But the Bible does not say Molech ended. It says the altars ended. Those are different things. Molech was never a statue. Statues can be broken. Statues can be buried, archived, exhibited in museums under controlled lighting with informational plaques nearby. Molech was a theology, and theologies do not require stone to persist. The theology of Molech is this: security requires sacrifice. Protection can be purchased. The most precious thing you have is the most valuable currency available. And when the threat is real enough, when the fear is great enough, when the logic has been followed carefully and patiently enough, the offering of what should never be offered becomes not an atrocity, but a necessity, a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation, something you tell yourself you had no choice about. That logic did not retire when the Topheth was defiled by Josiah. It adapted. It shed the name. It kept the structure. Consider what the ancient system actually required to function. It required a dedicated location, removed from the main city, accessible only to those with the right connections. It required a priest class, intermediaries who managed access, collected the offerings, and maintained the silence of the surrounding institution. It required participants powerful enough to afford the premium and frightened enough to pay it. It required, above all, a mechanism for ensuring that what happened in the valley stayed in the valley. In ancient Canaan, that mechanism was the drums, the noise that made it impossible to hear clearly what was happening inside the fire. Every generation has its version of the drums. In the 21st century, investigators began uncovering a network that operated on a private island in the Caribbean. The details that emerged over years of legal proceedings, sealed documents, and delayed disclosures described a system with a logic so familiar to a student of ancient religion that the resemblance becomes difficult to ignore once you have seen it. A remote location, a carefully curated list of participants drawn from the highest levels of wealth and political power. Children, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but actual children, used as the currency of the transaction. And surrounding the entire structure, a silence maintained not by drums, but by their modern equivalent: legal agreements, institutional protection, strategic relationships with people in positions to ensure that certain names never appeared in certain documents. The list exists. It has existed for years. The names on it are known to the people who have seen it. And the most disturbing thing about that list is not who is on it. It is how long the drums played before anyone was allowed to hear what was happening behind them. This is not a conspiracy. It is a pattern. It is the oldest pattern in human religious history, stripped of its theological vocabulary and dressed in the language of modern finance and private aviation and sealed court records. The altar changed shape. The valley became an island. The priests became lawyers and fixers and powerful friends. The votive stones with their carved dedications became encrypted communication and carefully maintained social appearances. And the children remained what they had always been in this system, not people, currency. The premium paid at the top of the transaction pyramid by those who had already traded everything else and still wanted more. Jeremiah recorded God's response to the Topheth in chapter 32. I did not command them, nor did it come into my mind, that they should do this abomination. Read that again in the context of a world where this was happening on an island registered to a private foundation, while presidents and prime ministers flew in and out on private aircraft, and the relevant authorities looked at the relevant documents and found reasons to look away. It didn't come into my mind. The grief in that sentence has no bottom. Baal lives wherever faith is reduced to transaction, wherever the relationship with God is replaced by a commercial arrangement, wherever blessing is treated as evidence of divine favor, and the covenant becomes a contract to be renegotiated. Asherah lives wherever God is quietly reshaped to fit human comfort, wherever the parts of Scripture that demand holiness are set aside in favor of a deity who affirms everything and requires nothing. And Molech lives wherever innocence is sacrificed on the altar of security, wherever the most vulnerable are offered up so that the fear or the appetite or the influence of those making the offering can be maintained, wherever the logic of transaction is followed carefully enough and long enough to arrive at the conclusion that the thing which should never be given is the one thing the system requires. Not always in fire, not always in a valley, not always on an island, but always the same architecture, always the same silence, always the same list of names that the powerful spend enormous resources ensuring you never read. The names changed. The altars did not. In 570 BC, the prophet Ezekiel watched the glory of God, the visible, luminous presence that had inhabited the temple since the days of Solomon, begin to move. It rose slowly from its place above the ark. It moved to the threshold of the temple and paused there, the way a presence lingers at the edge of a place it loves before it leaves. Then it moved east. It came to rest above the Mount of Olives, looking back at Jerusalem across the valley one final time. Then it was gone. No thunder, no earthquake, no declaration, just absence. The most devastating judgment God ever rendered on Israel was not a plague or an army or a fire from the sky. It was his departure. The temple stood for a few more years before Nebuchadnezzar's army came. When they burned the building to the ground, they were burning a structure that had already been vacated. The shell was destroyed. The presence had left long before. But the story does not end in absence. It never ends in absence. 600 years later, a man stood on that same mountain. He came from Galilee. He rode into Jerusalem while crowds laid cloaks on the road before him and called out words from the Psalms of Ascent. And when he reached the place on the Mount of Olives that looked out over the city, the same eastern vantage point from which the glory had departed, he stopped and he wept. Luke records the Greek word precisely, not a dignified expression of concern, not a diplomatic sadness. He wailed. The glory that had departed came back with a human face, human hands, human tears. It came back to the same mountain. It looked at the same city, and instead of leaving in silence, it wept over what the city had done, and what, even now, it was still choosing. The God of the valley demanded children. The God of the mountain wept for them, and then he walked down from that mountain and into the city, not to condemn it, not to call fire down from heaven. He walked into it the way a shepherd walks into the place where the sheep have been lost the longest. He came to do what no transaction could ever accomplish, and what no offering of what should never be offered was ever able to buy. He came to give what Molech demanded, freely, once for all, and in doing so to end the logic of the transaction entirely, not with a reform that could be reversed in 23 years, with something that the Valley of Slaughter, for all its fire, could not undo. Which of these three gods, Baal, Asherah, or Molech, do you believe is the greatest threat to this generation? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and if this opened something in you that you want to keep exploring, subscribe. There is more coming that you will not want to miss. This narrative is based on accounts from the sacred scriptures and historical and archaeological sources. Images and videos generated by artificial intelligence were used to illustrate and dramatize the biblical and historical events presented.